If my paintings get you, then they get you before the sensible man has had time to draw any conclusions about them at all. I mean, I have found that if you produce an image irrationally, that people who look at that image will also be seized by it on an irrational level. What was borne in on me as a result of these visions and so on was the real existence of an inner reality. And if you can paint what you saw, it's a way of making concrete this rather fugitive thing which would otherwise completely disappear.
My father, Victor Willing, died in 1988, just as his career was about to be transformed. If he hadn't died, I believe he would have gone on to become one of Britain's most celebrated artists, perhaps as successful as his wife, my mother, Paula Rego. Victor was born in Alexandria, Egypt, when his father, a professional soldier, was stationed there with his regiment. His childhood was spent constantly moving around, never in the same school for long, as the British Army posted his parents to Malta, then different locations around England. Throughout this period, he showed considerable talent for drawing, and after his military service and a brief spell at Guildford School of Art, he was accepted into the Slade.
In 1949, when he went into the Slade, he obviously adored it, and mingling with all these interesting new people, especially the women, I suppose. I'm sure there were as many women as there were men. And he just threw himself into the life there, which was fairly bohemian, must be said.
He looked like a marmoset, but he was very charismatic. But you know how it is. When one's in love with someone, everything about them seems to be so marvelous. We never spoke very much. It was a kind of understanding of a different kind. And I just went with him to the studio, sat for him quite a lot. There's a wonderful picture he did of me, a wonderful, wonderful nude he did of me. And I just didn't think of anything else, really. It was l'amour fou, you know. I mean, it was something unimaginable. It wasn't like those boyfriends, you know. It was something else, and it was just overpowering. It's a wonder I survived it, really. And in the end, he was very good to me, really good to me in the end.
He was the big star of the Slade when Paula was there as a student, because he had a show with the sort of leading gallery of the time shortly after he left the Slade. It was the Hanover Gallery. So he was, you know, it was very glamorous for Paula.
Did you fall for him right away?
Yes, because he was so intelligent and he knew so much about painting. He was so smart, so clever. He was just extraordinary man. And he was a very good painter. Although he was married, his wife was a ballet dancer and he painted her very well too. But that didn't come into it because he lived in London and his wife lived in Guildford.
Did he tell you that he was married?
Yeah.
Really, right away?
Yeah, of course everybody knew he was married. And I mean, yeah, sure. But she never turned up at the Slade or anything. She was always at home. And I never saw her, I only met her once. And I wasn't particularly jealous. She's strange, isn't it? He seemed so different, so independent from other married men.
Well, Hazel was his girlfriend. They were lovers from the time they were 16, according to Hazel. So I think he finally decided that he ought to do the honourable thing and decided to marry Hazel, which he did in 1951.
But he must have already been seeing a lot of other girls at the Slade at the time.
Oh, yes, indeed, and continued to do so. We had a flat in Lancaster Gate with several bedrooms. Hazel came up eventually, started living there. But of course, there was still Paula there in the background. And when Hazel wasn't there, Paula would visit.
When I got pregnant with Cassie and I was alone in the house, and Vic rang me up and said to me, "I'm afraid I'm going back to my wife."
Oh. And is this because he knew you were pregnant?
Yes, he knew I was pregnant, yes. And the next thing I did was to ring up my dad. And he said, "Don't worry, I'll be there in 2 days and I'll bring you back with me." And he did. In 2 days he was in England from Portugal. And next thing I knew, Cassie was born.
Dad told me that being thought of as a future star of the art world couldn't make up for feeling hungry every day. He had to rely on his friend, Francis Bacon, to buy him breakfast, often the only meal of the day. And he said he couldn't stop thinking about Mum and the daughter he didn't know.
You know, in those days, the idea was, and it was quite accepted, was that artists should have their patron who would support them, provide necessary money. I mean, Bacon did, you see. Colin Anderson gave money to Bacon to keep him going. Bacon would go off to Monte Carlo and gamble it all, and then fail to give him the painting in return. But there was a lot of discussion when Vic finally left the Slade in 1953 as to who should be his appropriate patron, and various people were discussed. Kenneth Clark might be approached. But of course this didn't make enough money anywhere near. Artists didn't make a lot of money. Paintings didn't fetch a lot of money. Even Bacon's didn't fetch a lot of money. They fetched a few hundred, you know, in the early 50s. People needed more than that.
So when did Dad eventually leave his wife?
Oh, weeks later. He wrote to my father, and my father wrote back and said, "Come over." Just like that.
Dad arrived after Christmas when I was 1. Dad was the artist. He was the main artist. He was the better known. Mum was younger, and he wasn't her tutor in any way. He didn't tell her what to do. He just supported her. Where I think they did affect each other is, you know, they painted in the adega. She was on one side, he was on the other, and there was just a screen of rush matting that hung between the two. But Mum just painted and painted and painted. The productivity was endless. And on the other side of the screen, Dad couldn't work. The critical voice in his head was catastrophic. It completely crippled him. The only reason some of the paintings in this room survive is because Baba would steal them. "Oh, this looks nice, I'll have it for my living room," you know, and just take them away, because or else they'd be painted over.
We lived in this house in Ericson. It had a sort of dreamlike quality about it. We lived simply, and Paul would go off down to the Adega to get on with her painting. Caroline would be playing with her dollies. And I'd be sitting there and I would think to myself, Now, what is wrong with my life? Why do I have to sort of worry about making my way in the world, you know, becoming famous and all that? This is it, for God's sake. Increasingly, I fell into a sort of long daydream. I completely lost interest in a career.
The daydream led to pictures which were, up till then, Dad's most imaginative, and in some ways they can be seen as precursors of his powerful later work. Excited, he rolled them up, put them on the roof rack of his Renault Floride and drove them back to London to show his friends in the art world.
You know, they didn't know what to make of it. They really didn't. Including Andrew Forge, yes, who was really pretty old-fashioned, really. Advised your father to go back to painting the nude, you know. So they didn't really like these because they didn't know what to make of them. They really didn't.
66 was the year that Dad got officially diagnosed with MS.
It only sunk in as Dad started getting more and more incapacitated. You know, he had the stick and then he had crutches.
And Mum went into a massive depression. I mean, she just kind of shut down.
Dad used to say that when you thought things couldn't get any worse, they usually did. And so it was in 66, when, to add to their troubles, Paula's father, the man who had supported them, died.
And then he died. I took him to hospital. I watched him die.
Just before he died, my grandfather told Mum that she should sell his electronics business and move to London. But I remember Dad thinking this was his chance to pay the family back. So he turned himself into a businessman, started wearing a suit and convinced everyone that he, a painter with limited Portuguese, should take over my grandfather's specialist electrical engineering factory.
I think maybe he thought that that would put him in a position to be able to paint exactly as he wanted, without having to think about whether the pictures would sell, whether they'd be appreciated, whether other people would think he was doing the right thing, all that.
It was a disaster. It's my fault. I should have stopped him. But I didn't.
Well, you didn't stand up to Dad very often, though, did you? I mean,
Never.
You never stood up to him, so if you wanted to do something, you wouldn't.
He'd do it.
He was really suffering. He was suffering from the paralysis. The business was going tits up. There was no money. Everything was mortgaged because of him. So it's not as if this happened to Dad. He caused it to happen. He instigated it. He drove it forward. He was going to make good, and actually he was going to lose everything.
We lost everything. We lost the Quinta, we lost everything. Everything.
So when we came to live in London, we were completely broke, weren't we?
Yes.
I think Dad probably thought that was it. And the only thing he could do, end of Act 2, lose your house, lose your wife, dog dies, you know. Act 2, turning point. You bloody get on with it.
So after a lifetime so far for him of having painter's block, if you will.
Yeah.
When things couldn't be at their worst, he starts to paint.
Well, when it really took off was when he had nothing else to fall back on. All was lost, pretty much.
I didn't know what to do. I couldn't get a job. I wasn't good at anything. And I started painting hopelessly, really, with no ambition. And it was at this time that I started having these visions.
He had visions, which is most odd. He saw the picture on the wall and then he painted it. And he saw these pictures ready-made. Very strange.
It was here and he was just transferring it there. There was no hesitation, there was no... The image was in his mind and he was just putting it on the canvas.
He painted these scenes which are sort of reveries of space with a hint of menace about them in many cases, and are quite extraordinary and not at all like anybody else, but they do accord with his life, with his memories of Egypt as a child, being in a military camp and, you know, being locked away and hung up in a cupboard as a child. That sort of comes into it.
My mother was a beefy sort of woman and knocked me about a bit when I was a kid. I have a very strong memory of my mother's very thick arms, and she tended to get emotional about things at times, and these enormous boughs would flail around, and you had to be jolly careful about keeping out of the way.
He was incredibly brave. He went to Space Studio, got himself a studio. He bought these canvases which were a mile long, and he was already limping from MS with crutches, and he moved into these crappy studios and started painting these big paintings. I thought, who on earth is going to buy these big pictures? He must be crazy. But they did. It's when he risked everything and he went for it that he got them. And it made a big impact, like Nick's Rota giving him a show at the Whitechapel. Because it made Vic's life, you know? It did, made Vic's life.
I think I might have gone on living rather vain, egotistical sort of life if I had enjoyed good health. Whereas this did make me become much more introspective.
He sort of went against the grain. He did his own thing. He wasn't influenced by what was happening in the art world at the time, whether it was other artists who were doing well, whether it was the market. The paintings are truly sort of personal and singular to him. They are his vision. And I think a lot of artists can learn a lesson from that, to sort of follow your own path, to look inward, to see at the sort of work that you want to make.
I mean, I'm not painting pictures in order to assert my position in the world or thinking of what I'm doing as a career. I don't paint pictures in order to improve the world. They're a sort of conversation with myself. It's an attempt to discover myself in a way. I mean, the world around you looks at you and they recognize you straight away. This is the person that you present to the world. But this leaves untouched the person that only you know. Well, we all have this problem, that we have an inner reality which only we can know. This is the self that we're inclined to forget about, because there isn't very much use for it in the world, this better part of ourselves, this more real part of ourselves. There comes a point where you begin to realize that this is the important bit, the bit that only you know. Now, I think that my painting is almost exclusively to do with that self that is normally neglected.